Will you pray with me? Holy One who sees us in our wombs, sees us in our ends. May our living in between, may our meditations today point toward you, your ever-embracing love of us and of all. Amen. With sorrow, we again gather to remember these precious individuals on Transgender Day of Remembrance and Resilience. Those we will name here, those whose names are known, and so many names who we do not know, whose lives were ended by murder or by suicide. We remember that the 382 names collected by the Trans Day of Remembrance organization are a significant undercount. Many, many people who died were not out to their families, or their families obscure their hard-fought-for identities in death by misgendering and misnaming them in their own obituary. The heartbreak of this day seems especially keen this year. All the names we were given to read are young ones from the United States. I asked Eve Pillay, who shares the name, why we didn't have international names this year. And she said the organization wanted us to remember that the problem is not just out there. The problem is right here in our midst. So many of them, far too many of them, died by suicide in a culture that seems bent on using them as props to win an election, foils for fomenting misplaced fear among our neighbors. And the sad truth is that beautiful children like Mars, who so many of us knew and prayed for, will continue to be used as props, as one-dimensional cardboard cutouts. Their parents' right to advocate for and even determine their health care needs may be removed. The life-saving gift of being known and called by the pronouns and names that you prefer might be taken away. Their ability to access life-saving care may shrink across this land. There is so much that we as an open and affirming congregation will be called upon to do to protect them. But it would be a mistake to only focus on those aspects of trans lives today. Because the truth is, trans people have much to teach us in today's moment of fear and trepidation. For generations, trans people have fought for themselves and each other in a world that told them they should not exist. Unlike so many of us that have benefited from the ease and access that comes from a perception of normalcy, trans people have always been on the outside looking in. They always have existed in our midst, in our communities, at times facing more threat than others, but most often facing threat to their personhood, their belonging, their identity. And yet throughout these threats, throughout these years, trans people have fought for joy. They have fought for their joy. Generation after generation, they have found their way to each other. Forced in their everyday lives to hide who they were, they created and sustained pockets of resistance where they could thrive despite the hardship of the outside world. In 1930, Harlem's Rockland Place hosted a masquerade ball on Valentine's Day. The New York Age, the prominent black newspaper of the time, reported it was difficult to distinguish between the sexes. The paper reported that women were rigged up in masculine attire while scores of males pronounced effeminate traits gracefully disported themselves in beautiful evening gowns. You know what else was happening in 1930? The worsening of the Great Depression. Pockets of resistance, pockets of joy. In the 1980s and 1990s, an underground dance scene developed in New York City and spread to other communities. That scene, called ballroom, offered a place for queer and trans, Black, and other people of color to gather in elaborate underground parties where dancing and performing in their full expressions were celebrated. Benji Hart and Michael Robinson, in an article in Time magazine, explain, from their inception, balls incorporated fashion, pageantry, and dance alongside community building and self-care. The scene also fostered a kinship system of houses, chosen families with anointed mothers and fathers, trans women and men, who guide and supported their children, who were often kicked out of their own homes and communities, and uplifted a collective rejection of both white supremacy and Black homophobia. You know what else was happening in the 1980s and 1990s to queer and trans people? The AIDS epidemic was decimating their communities. Their deaths utterly ignored. One estimate I read says that in the US, by 1995, 1 gay man in 9 had been diagnosed with AIDS, and 1 in 15 had died. Swaths of people were killed, and our government was silent. And yet in the ballrooms, they danced. Through oral histories and the work of ballroom scholars, voguers, which Madonna took and made famous. Do you all remember this? Some of you? Voguers trace their dance form's origins to pageants organized by incarcerated trans and queer people in Rikers Island prison in the late 1970s. One of the ballroom scene's signature categories, the original voguers, which was taken and not attributed by Madonna, in the 1990s, the original voguers created the dance as a source of entertainment, but also as a means of envisioning freedom while in a state of bondage. Pockets of resistance and joy. The names we will read and the names being read across the country and world represent terrible deaths. Some of the names we will read died being dismembered and dragged. Some of them died by their own lovers, whose own transphobia had them killing their partners when faced with exposure. And some of them died by suicide, worn out by fighting for their own dignity and worthiness in a world determined, it seems, to exterminate them. A mother to one of the young people who we remember today said, "Groups that have been targeting transgender people will probably try to say that my son was simply a tortured soul, a notion I reject. He was not a tortured soul," she said. "He was a ray of light. If he was tortured, it's because our culture has created a world in which people like Ash are not welcome." We remember these deaths because it helps us fight for the living. But we also need to remember their lives, to remember the joy and resilience that they lived with, to commit ourselves from learning from them. We remember their living because they deserve that too. The names we will read represent people who loved teddy bears and anime. They were getting their first job, their first car, their first internship, their first gender-affirming surgery. They were in love. They were exploring their new name or experimenting with new pronouns. They were known and loved by their fellow trans community, or they were fighting their way to them. They loved Disneyland and manicures with their mom. They volunteered at Sunday school and had dreams of becoming a music therapist. We are likely heading into a time of increased violence and attacks on trans people and targeted attacks on trans youth and their right to exist. As we fight for them, and I know that we will, let us also learn from them. Let us resist with them. Let us live into the joy of their being with them.